funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
One of the most controversial figures in Irish history is the 12th century King of Leinster, Diarmait MacMurrough, who invited the Normans into Ireland, an act which kick-started English Crown involvement in the country. Now, to discover more about Diarmait MacMurrough, I visited the town of Ferns in County Wexford, which was the capital of MacMurrough's Kingdom of Leinster during the medieval period. And here's who I met there.
My name is Catherine McPartlin, and we're standing here at the gravestone of Diarmait MacMurrough, the man responsible for the Norman, or rather, I was going to say invasion, the arrival of the Normans. A notorious, controversial figure, reputed to be a tyrant because of this said invitation to the Normans. He sought help, having been ousted by the High King at the time. He went for help to Henry II.
That being King Henry II of England.
And this resulted in him hiring some mercenary Norman troops to help him regain his kingdom. This in turn led to the invasion by Henry II, and once Henry arrived, the English Crown occupation of Ireland had truly begun.
Diarmait MacMurrough's act of bringing the Normans into Ireland during the 1160s marked the beginning of over 8 centuries of direct English and later British rule in Ireland. Now, for this reason, down the centuries he's been castigated as a traitorous archvillain who sold out his country to the English Crown. County Wexford historian Barry Lacey.
He was always the man associated with the so-called 800 years of foreign rule and brought in, and he was responsible for Cromwell and everything else that came after it and before it as well. So he always seemed to have got the bad end of the stick.
Certainly when I went to school, it was very clear that Diarmait MacMurrough was a despicable figure.
Diarmait MacMurrough, he's seen as a traitor, a man who betrayed his people.
In this documentary we're going to investigate whether in fact Diarmait MacMurrough, the 12th century King of Leinster, deserves his toxic reputation as the archvillain of Irish history who betrayed his country, or is he instead a scapegoat who's been unjustly treated and deserves exoneration?
Diarmait MacMurrough Kavanagh of Ferns, who is not kindly remembered by a lot of Irish history.
He is the man who is pointed at for being the one who brought the English to Ireland.
MacMurrough, he didn't necessarily foresee that Henry would follow up with the start of the English takeover of Ireland.
It turned into a full colonisation with the arrival of Henry II.
Certainly from the perspective of the Irish elite, the coming of Normans is a complete disaster. It's awful.
Diarmait MacMurrough, he did not intend at any stage to go and turn Ireland into a vassal state of Norman England.
Conquering any place is never good for any country.
His legacy is and always will be the lasting involvement of the English Crown in Ireland.
And before we delve further into the many historical controversies surrounding Diarmait MacMurrough, first we need to investigate his roots. Dr. Michael Potterton, lecturer in medieval history and archaeology at the Department of History in Maynooth University.
Diarmait MacMurrough, not much is known about him in the very early period, but he seems to have been born in about 1110, so 900 years ago or so. He was the son of Donogh MacMurrough, the King of Leinster at the time and King of Dublin, and Diarmait's mother was a woman by the name of Orla. They were members of the Kinsella or Kinsella family, the dynasty based at Ferns in County Wexford. Diarmait would have been educated in the Gaelic Brehon laws and Brehon ways of the time, probably in Terry Glass in Ormond, now Tipperary. He would have been fostered, which was fairly standard for the time, so he would have been with a foster family with whom he maintained fairly close connections through the rest of his life. According to one late 12th century source, Geraldus Cambrensis, or Gerald of Wales, Diarmait MacMurrough was tall, strong and courageous.
In the year 1115, when Diarmait MacMurrough was about 5 years of age, tragedy struck his family when his father Donegal was unexpectedly killed in Dublin. Dr. Ronan O'Flaherty, County Wexford-based historian and archaeologist.
His father, Donegal, is the king. He's either killed in battle or he's poisoned, but none of his children, his sons, are old enough to actually become king in their own right, so another family member steps in. 2 years later, the eldest son accedes to the throne. Then he is killed that same year. Shortly after that, then another son, Éanna, Diarmait's elder brother, he succeeds to the throne. He dies as well in Wexford. We're not entirely sure why. And what you're left with then is the 16-year-old Diarmait MacMurrough, now king of Leinster, and in a situation where nobody expected him to be king. He wasn't trained for this particular job. He wasn't made ready for it. It wasn't supposed to be him. It was never supposed to be him.
Wow, so he comes to the throne. The year is about 1126, if I'm correct, Ronan. What happens?
You're quite right. It's 1126 that he comes to the throne. What actually happens is that it's opportunity. So everybody is looking at this. This is a powerful kingdom. And they're looking and saying, there's a boy in charge here. So at that time you have, again, one of the most powerful kings, certainly in Ireland, and arguably a very powerful king even by European terms. And this is Turlough O'Connor. And he is High King of Ireland. Being High King doesn't mean that you actually rule the entire country. It just means that you are the toughest and the strongest man. And he sees an opportunity. So he begins what becomes known as the harrowing of Leinster. He attacks Leinster, he decimates it. Turlough O'Connor. His plan is in fact to go and put his own son on the throne. So this is what he tries to do. He comes into Wexford, he attacks, he harrows it, and he also sends his champion with them to lead it, which is Tiernan O'Rourke.
Tiernan O'Rourke being the king of Breffni, a Gaelic kingdom comprising the modern counties of Cavan and Leitrim, as well as parts of neighbouring counties. Now, in the wider arc of Irish history, O'Rourke's role in the military campaign to oust the young Diarmait MacMurrough from power was very important.
It's very important because Tiernan is quite a bloody and ruthless man. He's being told to go and effectively bring Leinster into a rule, I suppose, to bring it within the house, bring it into the house of O'Connor, and to do whatever he needs to do to make that happen. So he decimates the country. He burns crops. He slaughters animals. He decides he's going to starve the MacMurroughs into submission, if that's what's going to be required. He'll do whatever it takes. He just completely destroys Leinster, and in doing so he sets a basis now for a lifetime of retribution, revenge and vengeance that will colour Diarmait MacMurrough's career hereafter. Hereafter he may want many things. He may want to be king of Leinster, he may want to be king of Ireland as well, but he also wants to get even with Tiernan O'Rourke.
Diarmait, he never forgot Tiernan O'Rourke's actions against him at that time.
Michael Potterton.
But MacMurrough does return to power in 1132, and he does this through astute negotiations, but also fairly ruthless activities. And one of the things we're told about in the early sources is how he wrested control of a major church in his territories, the Church of Kildare, by having its abbess forcefully removed, imprisoned, and indeed raped. And then the church itself was burned, and 140 or 150 individuals seems to have been burned in that fire. And so Diarmait was a fairly vicious and cruel individual, albeit a man with great skills and astuteness as well.
So was Diarmait MacMurrough's treatment of the Abbess of Kildare a normal occurrence for the time? Sean Duffy, Professor of Medieval Irish and Insular History at Trinity College, Dublin.
I think it was an unusual thing. I mean, we are blessed in Ireland, which we tend not to to realise that we're blessed by the amount of historical material that we do have for the Middle Ages. So we have annals that begin in the 6th century and they are continuous. And they're called annals for a reason. They have an annual record of the important events of every single year. And if you go through that annual record for hundreds of years up to Diarmait MacMurrough, you would struggle to find another occurrence of a similar kind of an event. So I do think it was unusual and it was exceptionally ruthless, and it did mark Diarmait out as somebody not to be trifled with.
By the 1130s, Diarmait MacMurrough had consolidated his family's traditional power base in Leinster, Ronan of Flaherty.
And he's become now quite a powerful king in his own right. He allies himself with different people, including the O'Connors at different stages. He allies himself subsequently with other claimants of the High Kingship, with the Ineal, the MacLaughlins. So he allies himself with them at one stage as well. He shows himself to be extremely astute in who he chooses as his allies, and he becomes more and more powerful as time goes on. When he reaches his peak, he's controlling much of the southern half of Ireland, either directly or indirectly, and is also building up a network of alliances overseas.
Right, okay. And what period are we talking about when he reaches the apex of his power and expands his territory, please?
As the 40s and 50s is the period we're looking at there. He now actually becomes so powerful that he begins to introduce new orders into the country from overseas. So these are religious orders. So he's now become very much the model of a European prince. He sees himself as being in that model that he has observed overseas, because we go back again, the MacMurroughs maintain this link overseas with England and with the continent in a way that many Irish families and kingdoms did not. So he's acutely aware of what's happening in Britain, acutely aware of what's happening on the continent. He can see the new developments, the ideas of church reform, and that he wants to bring those into Ireland himself. So he gets involved in church reform. He establishes monasteries and abbeys.
On the one hand, Diarmait MacMurrough was a warmonger who was prone to doing very violent things. On the other hand, he is one of the great patrons of the Irish Church in the 12th century.
Professor Sean Duffy of Trinity College, Dublin. Here's County Wexford historians Barry Lacey and then Nicholas Furlong.
Diarmait was a great church builder himself. He built obviously Ferns, but Baltinglass Abbey and all that.
Diarmait MacMurrough was a wonderful man for church reform. I mean, he founded monasteries all over Ireland.
During his reign as King of Leinster, MacMurrough commissioned many churches and abbeys. In addition, he was a fervent supporter of the Catholic Church's reform movement of the period. So what exactly was this movement about? Historian Dr. Sean O'Hare-Vard of the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies.
At this time in Ireland, this is the time of the European ecclesiastical reform movement, or sometimes called the Gregorian reform movement after Pope Gregory. And what the reformers essentially want in the Irish context is they want to change certain church practices. So they want to put an end to hereditary control of church offices, for example. They also want to reform Irish marriage practice, which they see as uncanonical. Irish kings and other persons were taking multiple partners. Most historians are agreed that this was in a system of serial monogamy, so they were marrying, divorcing and remarrying someone else. Some historians think it was polygamy, that they were marrying multiple wives at the same time. But as I say, most historians think serial monogamy. So the reformers wanted to change this aspect. And the reformers also wanted to bring in continental monastic orders, so to reform Irish monasticism by bringing in orders like the Augustinians and the Cistercians, and they bring these orders to Ireland. So where does Diarmait MacMurrough fit into this? Well, he was a patron of the reform movement. He patronised new foundations like Baltinglass. He supported the introduction of these orders.
However, despite Diarmait MacMurrough's church patronage exploits, nevertheless, he still clung to the old ways in certain matters. Sean O'Hervard.
We know that his own marriage practices were not in line with the reformed agenda. He had more than one wife, and his wives were drawn from other powerful families within the province. So, at least in one respect, he continued to follow the unreformed Irish marriage practice.
Right, so he was kind of keeping a foot in each camp, so to speak. The old ways, the Brehon ways, the old Gaelic ways, and the new European reform ways that were coming from Europe, yeah?
Yeah, yes, I think what we're talking about here is a very practical man who is looking to use things to his advantage. So if he perceived the reform movement to be gaining ground in Ireland, he may well have sponsored them to be associated with them and to derive benefit from contact with them.
Diarmait is not someone who's a spiritual person who's inspired by some sort of religious movement.
Historian Dr. Conor Costick of Trinity College, Dublin.
He is in the forefront of religious reform, but it's quite pragmatic.
And veering away from the topic of Diarmait MacMurrough's church patronage activities, in 1152 MacMurrough was involved in an incident that was to have huge ramifications for both himself and Irish history. That year he abducted Dervagilla, the wife of Tiernan O'Rourke, the King of Breffni, who many years before had ravaged Diarmait MacMurrough's kingdom and whom MacMurrough hated with a vengeance. Sean Duffy.
MacMurrough, at that time, he was allied with the King of Connacht, and they marched up into Breffni, which is in the Middle Ages was County Cavan and County Leitrim, that part of the world. Its king was a man called Tiernan O'Rourke. Like MacMurrough, also very ambitious. They both had competing interests in that one of the ancient provinces of Ireland was the province of Midde. That word Midde, M-I-D-E, gives you the modern word Meath, and Westmeath, of course, is a later county. So it's Meath, Westmeath, that Midlands province in the country. It was in decline in the 12th century, and they all had their eyes on it. They were all trying to grab a bit of it for themselves. So Tiernan O'Rourke is based up in Cavan and Leitrim. He is pushing into Meath from the north and west. MacMurrough is based down in South Leinster, gets control of Dublin. Then he wants to push up northwesterly up into Meath himself and grab a chunk of it. So needless to say, there are loggerheads over those political ambitions. But in this event that happened in 1152, when they had a bit of a minor squabble, a minor battle between the two of them, MacMurrough apprehended, it seems, abducted O'Rourke's wife, who was the daughter of the King of Meath, and she becomes known as Dervagilla in the Latin sources. If she was alive today in Ireland, her name would be Derval. It was a very, very common Irish woman's name at the time, and she was a very significant woman in her own right, and she too was a great patron of the church and built one of the magnificent churches that survives at Clonmacnoise. But the sources tell us that MacMurrough abducted her, and he brought her away with all her goods, with all her chattels, all her properties and so on, and brought her away. And then in the following year she was allowed to return. Now, what was this about? I mean, none of us have a clue, to be honest, what it was about. Giraldus Cambrensis and the Song of Dermot and the Earl, they turn it into a great kind of a sort of a tragic love story or something like that, kind of a Helen of Troy thing.
The Song of Dermot and the Earl being an important 12th century historical source, and Giraldus Cambrensis being a 12th century historian.
And Giraldus, of course, he's a misogynist of the worst kind. So he says it was all her fault. She obviously encouraged them because all the great sins of the world are caused by women, he says. From Adam and Eve in the garden, that kind of thing. But to be honest, we don't know. I mean, it's not a love story. I mean, they were middle-aged. Derval, or Dervagilla, she would have been in her 40s, I suppose, at the time. MacMurrough probably likewise. So I think it was a political act. What I mean by political act is MacMurrough wanted control of the powerful kingdom of Meath. He had a rival for that in O'Rourke, and so he wanted to outmaneuver O'Rourke, and one way of doing that is to undermine him publicly.
And perhaps there was no better way for Diarmait MacMurrough to publicly undermine and insult Tiernan O'Rourke than to abduct his wife, historian Ronan O'Flaherty.
The main thing that happens in this is that the act of doing this is an act of grave insult. And it's a grave insult because he does not pay the honour price to Tiernan O'Rourke. The honour price, under Brehon law, if I have harmed you, if I've done something to you, I don't go to prison for that, but I pay you money. So I'm fined. And the Brehon law is full of exquisite detail on how much people should be paid for what. So he should have paid Tiernan O'Rourke for this. He should have compensated him for the shame. Because he didn't, he magnified the shame. And he did that quite deliberately. And in fact, he makes it worse then because he sends her back. And he sends her back without the honour prize. So now it's as good as saying, I've had her and I'm finished and you can have her back.
Wow. So Tiernan O'Rourke, like, this was a huge, the mother of all scandals in the Ireland of its day, am I right? And well beyond as well. It even hit the headlines in Europe.
It is, and it's because he doesn't pay the honour price. And that's not an oversight. You know, he knew he should have paid the honour price. He deliberately did not pay the honour price. That made it technically abduction and rape under Brehon law. Had he paid, it wouldn't have been. But he didn't, and he chose to do so deliberately.
I don't think there's any doubt that Tiernan O'Rourke is keen to exact his own revenge on Diarmait MacMurrough for absconding with his wife, whatever the reasons or the background for that were.
Historian Dr. Michael Potterton of Maynooth University.
But this doesn't happen immediately. He doesn't get the opportunity for his revenge immediately. And in the interview...
It's a running sore
over
the next few years, and it ain't forgotten, that's for sure, to put it mildly.
That's for sure. And there are a number of other events that take place that also get Tiernan O'Rourke's back up. And he is just waiting, biding his time until the right moment comes, until he can get his own back on this upstart MacMurrough.
In the year 1166, about 14 years after the abduction of his wife, Tiernan O'Rourke eventually got his chance to exact revenge on Diarmait MacMurrough, when MacMurrough's key ally, the then High King of Ireland, MacLachlan, fell from power, Sean Duffy.
Diarmait MacMurrough, his fortunes were very much tied in with MacLachlan, the King of Ulster, who was the High King of Ireland. And when MacLachlan fell from power in 1166, that was curtains for Diarmait MacMurrough, to be honest.
In the sense that Diarmait MacMurrough's enemies, led by Tiernan O'Rourke, attacked his kingdom, with the intention of destroying him. Fern's local historian, Catherine McPartlan.
The attack was made and MacMurrough was ousted, and Tiernan wasn't happy, but obviously very pleased when he ousted the King of Leinster, his arch enemy for many years. But it resulted in MacMurrough leaving Ferns and being kicked out, actually. But before he left, and probably because of the hatred of O'Rourke, he burned Ferns. He did not want to give them any advantage to the victors.
And with his kingdom lost, Diarmait MacMurrough was forced to flee abroad. Now, it was at this juncture that he decided to ask the Norman King of England, Henry II, for military assistance to win back his kingdom of Leinster. So was MacMurrough's policy of seeking outside help the norm at the time? Historian Rob Goodbody of the Historical Committee of the Religious Society of Friends in Ireland.
I think it was, and I think it's still the norm today. I mean, we have numerous occasions in our own lifetimes when countries, best known of them would be the United States, where they go in to other countries to assist them where it suits the politics of the country that's providing the military backup. But throughout history this has happened. And so what Diarmait MacMurrough did was, I don't think it stands out as anything unusual in history.
In the mid-12th century, Irish kingdoms were constantly at war with one another, and it was kind of fairly well par for the course for an Irish chieftain who was in a row with another Irish chieftain. It was fairly normal for someone like that to seek an alliance with whoever he could. And it wasn't a question of inviting in a military force from a foreign country, because there was constant movement back and forward across those seas. We must remember that back in the 5th century, the Irish had invaded the west coast of Scotland and driven the Picts eastward. So if you want to blame somebody for invading somebody else, you start by blaming the Irish for taking over a chunk of Scotland and giving the names, their own name, Scoti, to the country of Scotland.
County Wicklow-based historian Diarmait MacMurrough. Diarmait MacMurrough initially fled to Wales and England and then to Aquitaine in France in order to get military assistance from King Henry II of England. Now, MacMurrough's cause was helped by the fact that a short while before he'd helped Henry out, Michael Potterton.
Diarmait, but he does seem to have been helpful to Henry in Wales in 1165 with the provision of ships and perhaps other things. And so that's exactly where he headed. He went to Wales. He possibly didn't know that Henry was in Aquitaine. He went to Wales, probably through England, down through France, into Aquitaine, finally caught up with Henry, and he said, remember me? I'm the fellow who helped you out. Things have gone pear-shaped for me back home. Now I need some help. And Henry seems to have said, look, Diarmait, I'd love to help you. I'm tied up here. My hands are full in Aquitaine. You know the way Eleanor is. But you can go back the way you came, and whatever support you can pick up from my subjects, you can take them with you with my blessing.
So how did Diarmait MacMurrough's recruitment campaign among Henry's subjects go? Medieval historian Dr. Grace O'Keefe.
It's a little slow. It's not it's not a rip-roaring success initially. But he does get a crew over in 1167. So the first crowd that come over, like we think of 1169 as the big date.
But the first wave is 1167.
The first group is 1167.
Anglo-Norman knights and Diarmait MacMurrough in tow,
yes, yeah.
wanting to get back his kingdom.
Yeah. So the first wave is 1167. It's a relatively small group, but they make inroads in, they back Diarmait up, and it seems that perhaps they've done enough, they've done their job, they've given him, a bit of a boost. And certainly it's made clear to people like Rory O'Connor, like Tiernan O'Rourke, that, Diarmait's not out of the picture. He's not going to go down without a really good fight. But 1167 kind of isn't enough for anyone. They've sort of had their appetites whetted by what they came across in 1167, including Diarmait, who is now thinking, do you know what? Maybe I could push this a bit further. I could push up further into Leinster. I could get Dublin. I could move out,
and expand.
And expand.
And get power.
And get power. And get more power.
Because the big thing here is that, when's the next big wave? Okay, a first wave is 1167, a small beachhead, if you want to call it. And what's the next big one?
1169.
So this is May 1169. Yes. Where does it occur?
So it's down off Banno Bay. So now you have a much bigger group arriving, and their ambitions are certainly far beyond what they had been in 1167. And I think one of the differences perhaps as well that you see this time is that the men who are coming over, and I think this is
they were led by Robert Fitzstephen and Myler Fitzhenry, this bigger group.
Yes, yeah. You see ambitions that are not connected necessarily to Diarmait. So it's no longer that we're here to help this guy. This is a small little foreign job that we're over here in Ireland.
In other words, we're no longer mercenaries. We're kind of conquistadors, maybe. Think Cortes, South America.
I'd still say
that kind of maybe veering on that.
I'd give them another year here before I'd start calling them conquistadors. So I'd still call them mercenaries at this stage.
May 1169, a joint MacMurrough Norman military force captured the town of Wexford. By the way, throughout this documentary, contributors use either of the two terms Norman or Anglo-Norman to describe those mercenaries whom Diarmait MacMurrough brought into Ireland, since different historians use different phraseology to describe them. Now, when the High King of Ireland, Rory O'Connor, heard of the MacMurrough Norman invasion, he made peace with MacMurrough on condition that he'd regain his ancestral lands, as well as send his Norman allies home. Diarmait MacMurrough had no intention of keeping his promise, and soon afterwards welcomed yet more Normans. In August 1170, the Norman Knight Strongbow arrived into Waterford harbour and, with MacMurrough in tow, besieged the town. Dr. Conor Costick, TCD lecturer and author of the book Strongbow, the Norman Invasion of Ireland.
Waterford is a big challenge because the Hiberno-Norse have built walled towns that are pretty good defensive structures, and any invasion, amphibious invasion, is always precarious at the beginning when you could be thrown back. There's some Irish support for the Hiberno-Norse in Waterford, so it's the numbers are fairly closely matched. But again, the Norman technique is superior. They're able to assault the walls and survive thanks to their heavy armour, and also because the local regulations for house building, this is a centuries-old tradition here in Ireland, have been neglected. And some idiot, has used the strength of the wall to secretly put a beam into the walls to hang their own house off. So when the Normans can break the house, they can weaken the wall and they can break through. So Waterford is sacked. Diarmait MacMurrough is actually shocked by the consequence of the sack. He's used to, when you have a win, you round up your enemies and then you do exchanges. And then the wheeling and dealing starts. Normans weren't interested in that. They just were they were just killing even the aristocrats. Well, hang on now. Because from the Norman point of view, it's all or nothing. We're here to stay. So we don't want any of these property owners around because we're going to take their property.
The Normans, they captured 70 of the citizens of Waterford. They took them out to a cliff face. They mutilated them. They broke their legs and their arms and so on, and they hurled them over the cliff as a kind of a lesson to the people of Waterford that that rebellion was futile and so on. So it was this is conquest. It's military conquest, and it was an ugly. It was an ugly affair, so we shouldn't romanticize it. Because sometimes we have a tendency to think, the Normans, the lovely big castles and all the rest of it. But, these are people who came over to conquer land here in Ireland. And that was not virgin territory, it wasn't lying there unoccupied. It had its own owners, and they had to be pushed aside.
Professor Sean Duffy of Trinity College, Dublin. Shortly after the combined MacMurrough and Norman army captured Waterford, as previously agreed, Strongbow was married to MacMurrough's daughter Aoife, on the understanding that he would succeed Diarmait MacMurrough as King of Leinster. Now, the Normans brought a level of military power unlike anything seen before in Ireland. So just how skilled were they in warfare? Historian Dr. Michael Potterton of Maynooth University.
Well, the Irish opponents certainly had their skills, and they certainly had their weaponry and their experience, but nothing like the level that these Anglo-Norman soldiers and mercenaries would have had. These were people who made their bread and butter by fighting across Europe. These were Norman warriors who had fought and descended from generation after generation of fighters. They were used to horseback cavalry, they were used to a variety of weapons and battlefield techniques that the Gaelic Irish simply weren't aware of, and if they were aware of it, in most cases they weren't able to compete with it.
What kind of military skills did they have that really trumped the day for them, the Normans?
Yeah, so they would have had organisation on a level that the Gaelic Irish didn't have. They would have used weapons like lances from their horses. They would have had suits of armour and helmets that would have protected them from any missiles and projectiles being fired at them.
The arrival of these into Ireland and the power that they display, smashing armies that are twice or three times their size, is something that sends shockwaves through Irish society at the time.
Ronan O'Flaherty. Here's Nicholas Furlong.
Like the German blitzkrieg, the Normans, they were war specialists. They were absolutely brilliant in tactics and everything else which they'd learned from the Crusades. They added spice and spearheads to Diarmait MacMurrough's army.
The Normans had perfected their weaponry.
They are the military strength at that time.
These are the shock troops of medieval Europe. These are incredible fighters.
They had better military technology, better swords, better arrows, and bigger horses. The Irish rode ponies. They were just better at winning battles.
Diarmait Malady. Here's County Wexford historian Bernard Brown.
Their chain mail and all that, and their just armoury just played a huge part in it, and the discipline was a factor in it as well. And they knew that Ireland was there for the taking.
After taking Waterford, the combined MacMurrough Norman military juggernaut set out via the Wicklow Mountains to attack and capture Dublin, which was controlled by the Hiberno Norse, Conor Caustic.
They get through the Wicklow Mountains and they come up to Dublin, but Dublin is very secure. Strong walls again, but also strong fleet. So there's no question of the Normans being able to besiege it. You know, the Liffey and the Irish Sea is open to the Hiberno Norse, not to them. So they start negotiations, and while the negotiations are taking place, a group of Normans, probably autonomously from Strongbow, because you've got to remember, it's not like a modern army. We can't say that the general has got authority over everything that happens. Far from it. Each of these knights has their own heroic tale to tell. I think it's Miles de Cogan says to his lot, "Look, the walls are undefended. Let's just go for it," and they do. So while the high chiefs are all negotiating what the deal's going to be, a group of Normans storm the walls. The rest carry on. Suddenly, they're in, and catastrophically for the Hiberno Norse, let the Normans in, and again another big massacre.
So what exactly was the significance of the capture of Dublin by Diarmait MacMurrough and his Norman allies? Historian Dr. Sean O'Hare-Vard of the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies.
The significance was that the town, which had been regarded as a prize for all the kings of Ireland throughout the 12th century and late 11th century, was now in the hands of somebody who had up to this point been a minor player, but who now clearly had his sights set on bigger things. And even Giraldus Cambrensis says that Diarmait set his sights on higher things and determined to bring under his control not just Leinster, not just Dublin, but the whole island. So he wanted now to supplant Rory O'Connor.
Now, Giraldus Cambrensis, he's the famous Norman historian, and so he's writing it from a very pro-Norman standpoint. But what do the other historical archives, what do yourselves, the historians, know, Sean? I mean, what was in Diarmait's mind? Did he want all of Ireland, or was he happy with just what he had, or what? What's your own opinion?
Well, I mean, it's quite clear that he expects only to be restored as King of Leinster when he first comes back to Ireland. He is probably impressed by the martial abilities of his new English and Anglo-Norman supporters, and he probably thinks that he can levy their abilities into a campaign for total supremacy on the island of Ireland. He probably thinks that this is what he can achieve.
But he's in control, not them. In other words, he's dictating policy. He's the guy who's co-opting their support, and they're not. Is that what happens in reality?
Well, he feels that he's in control, and also his Irish enemies think that he's in control. So it's really only when he dies, around May of 1171, that it becomes apparent that the driving force behind these conquests is not Diarmait MacMurrough, but rather his Anglo-Norman mercenaries.
The annals of history record that Diarmait MacMurrough died of natural causes when he was about 61 years of age in May 1171. So what was the reaction to his death? Historian Michael Potterton.
The death of Diarmait MacMurrough was a surprise to everybody, and no less than anybody else to Henry II. Henry had banked on Diarmait MacMurrough surviving. He was clearly aware of what was happening in terms of power in due course coming to Strongbow, but he would have been very aware of this. And when Diarmait MacMurrough went to look for Henry's support, Henry's attentions were elsewhere in Aquitaine and later back in Wales. This suddenly pricked up his ears and drew his attention back to Ireland, because a strong Anglo-Norman presence in Ireland was one thing if the Gaelic Irish were still in control. But if Strongbow started to carve out control, as indeed he began straight away in the summer of 1171, well, this posed potential threat to Henry II. Would Strongbow himself then seek the High Kingship of Ireland? And if he did, would he then become a thorn in the side of the English king on his western front? And Henry II clearly thought the answer to those questions were yes, and he was probably right.
And as a result, King Henry II of England landed at Waterford in October 1171 with an armada of 400 ships. So just what was the significance of Henry coming to Ireland? Professor Sean Duffy of Trinity College, Dublin.
Well, it was a big deal. I mean, it was a massive deal. It was probably the biggest, the contemporary sources say 400 ships he came in. Probably the largest armada Ireland had ever seen, a vast army. Now, it might only be 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 men. We don't know the exact numbers, and that mightn't seem like a lot by modern standards. But in the Middle Ages, it was a vast army, especially because they're very heavily armoured and sophisticated weaponry and all the rest of it. Something that an Irish army couldn't possibly compete with. So it was an extraordinarily significant event.
This is complete shock and awe tactic that he's bringing in. He's bringing such overwhelming force that nobody will stand against him, including the Normans who were actually there already. They all bow the knee. Strongbow likewise said it's all been a terrible mistake and a misunderstanding.
Ronan O'Flaherty. Here's Sean Duffy once again.
No reigning King of England had ever set foot in Ireland before October 1171. So it was a huge deal.
I mean, this was the big, I mean, it's not so much the Norman invasion, it's really the coming of Henry that's the game changer. Am I right, Sean?
Oh yeah, that is the event. I mean, it is the reason that you have a thing called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. 100 years ago, of course, it was the Great Britain and Ireland. It's the reason that we have had this really complex relationship, whereas previously we'd had perfectly amicable relations with England.
This is the first time that, if you want to call it, the English crown gets directly involved in Irish affairs, and it's been with us ever since, for however way you want to interpret that.
Yeah, so I mean, prior to that, it was a military event. Now it becomes a constitutional event. Because when Henry came to Ireland, he came to conquer Ireland. There's no two ways about it. He wasn't paying a kind of a royal visitation where he would just sort of stamp his approval on what was going on. As far as he's concerned, he is now the King of Ireland. Now, he doesn't call himself King of Ireland, but when he came to Dublin, he was only here for about 6 months, and he spent most of it in Dublin.
Henry sets up court in Dublin then when he comes to Dublin.
Medieval historian Dr. Grace O'Keefe.
And this is the part of the story which I think surprises a lot of people, and that is the Irish kings, or Irish princes as they're called in the English sources, the Irish kings doing fealty to Henry II when he's in Dublin at his Christmas court in Dublin.
Why?
Well, I think that it's perhaps a misguided attempt to kind of speak out of both sides of your mouth, maybe. And on the one hand, it's possible that the Irish princes were thinking, well, you know what? these are just kind of empty words. Like these kind of oaths of loyalty, these aren't, indicative of what you find in Ireland.
Because the de facto situation on the ground is I control my territory.
Yes, absolutely.
And even though this guy does have 400 ships, so to speak.
Yeah, and they have control of Dublin, which is concerning. So they think, well, if I give Henry the platitudes that he's looking for, he'll head off. But what he might do before he goes is kind of get control of his lads who are kind of running riot a bit in Ireland. So it's perhaps as a
safeguard my territory.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in other words, it was to protect their territory, but also they needed that, they needed access via Dublin or whatever.
Yes.
So they were thinking strategically, look, this is the way the wind is blowing now, let's move with it, but it's not going to fundamentally change the situation.
Yeah, so I can say whatever I want to him. Sure, he'll be gone. He's off over in England, he's off over in France. And once he's gone, then sure, things will just go back to normal, except that they don't go back to normal. One of the legacies that Henry left in Dublin was a tiny little parchment charter which is still in the Dublin City Archives, tiny little piece of parchment, in which, kind of bizarrely when you look at it first, he grants Dublin to the men of Bristol. And he says, I, Henry, Lord of yada yada yada, all his titles, I grant my city of Dublin. Now, it's interesting that he's calling it my city of Dublin. Like, he isn't a wet week here and he's calling it my city of Dublin. So he says, I grant my city of Dublin to the men of Bristol. And ultimately, what he is doing is trying to set in motion secure colonisation of Dublin with men from Bristol.
The reason being that Bristol had taken Henry's side in the English Civil War a few years previously.
Bristol remained loyal to Henry's family, and it's now, I suppose, being slightly rewarded in that what they are essentially being given is trading rights in Dublin. So they're saying, whatever rights you have to trade in Bristol, I am giving you those same rights in Dublin. And I suppose it's like an economic plantation, basically. So you get these loyal lads over from Bristol. They will set up business in Dublin. And this is part of what ultimately then turned Dublin into the centre of the English colony of Ireland.
Make no bones about it, once Henry set foot in Ireland, Ireland was an English colony. It was England's first colony, and we sometimes forget about that, but that is an undeniable fact, and it was only ever going to go in one direction after that.
And because history was only going in one direction after King Henry II of England claimed lordship over Ireland, Diarmait MacMurrough has been blamed by many for helping to kickstart this only going in one direction English Crown involvement in Ireland. Down the centuries he's been castigated in Irish history as a traitor who betrayed his country. County Wexford historian Miles Courtney.
He would have been the bête noir of the Irish at the time, because
the indigenous Gael, who lost out, who got the bad side of the deal.
That's basically it. Anybody who lost out to the Anglo-Normans had to have someone to blame for it, and he was the easy one to do it. Now, very easy to do it because he was the one who invited them in.
Diarmait MacMurrough, I think that he became the scapegoat.
So is Diarmait MacMurrough the scapegoat of Irish history, who's been unjustly treated and deserves exoneration? Or is he instead the arch-villain who deserves his toxic reputation? Historian Dr. Michael Potterton of Maynooth University.
I don't think he was an arch-villain, and I don't think he's entirely a scapegoat either. He had an important role to play. There is no denying that. There's nowhere you can say that Diarmait MacMurrough was not a catalyst in the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in Ireland. I think, however, that they probably would have come anyway, probably not quite as soon as they did. And so he had a role to play. I would like to see that there were possibly some positives in that as well. I would like to see that there were, in retrospect, that there were some things that went well, that there were some things that turned out to be good. Final word, scapegoat or archvillain? Scapegoat.
I think Diarmait has been a little bit unfairly castigated. Now, I'm not saying we should restore him and start putting statues up.
In other words, he is culpable, but not to the extent that he's been made out by prior generations.
Yeah, I think he didn't plan what ultimately happened.
He definitely opened the Pandora's box.
He definitely opened the Pandora's box, and he definitely instigated the arrival of these men to come in a military fashion and to have influence over Irish politics.
Historian Grace O'Keefe. Here's Rob Goodbody.
It wasn't in his scenario that the Normans would take over the whole of Ireland. And it wasn't in his scenario that Ireland would be oppressed by an incoming. The Normans took advantage of him. And so I think that his idea was to invite in a temporary force just to supplement his own resources to get his kingdom back. And I don't believe that was ever in his idea that this would be anything permanent or there would be anything more geographically widespread than his own immediate cause. So I think it goes down in history as one of the most momentously bad decisions, but I don't think that in any way that it was his intention the way it turned out.
This sort of thing happens. What he was doing, going overseas and bringing in mercenaries to go on and help solve a national problem, a domestic problem, nothing new in this. And in fact, a very similar situation happened in the south of Spain, where the Moors from North Africa were brought in.
And the Moors from North Africa were brought into Spain during the 8th century. Historian Dr. Ronan O'Flaherty.
The Moors were brought into the south of Spain, again to help out a domestic problem, and almost the same thing happened. They didn't go home, and they brought in more of their kindred across and created the incredible caliphate then of southern Spain, which was a fusion of so many different cultures, including Spanish, Christian, Jewish and Islamic cultures. It was an incredible state, and that emerged in exactly the same way from the process that we see happening in Ireland later.
The Normans, having conquered England in 1066, they were no respecters of borders, and they rapidly moved into Wales. And ultimately they conquered Wales in the late 13th century.
Professor Sean Duffy of Trinity College, Dublin.
They got into regular troubles with the Scots, and ultimately, of course, they attempted to conquer Scotland and had long centuries of warfare. That Scotland, which was a far wealthier kingdom than Ireland, struggled to resist. So, I mean, as far as they were concerned, the entire archipelago was theirs. So it was inevitable. So can we blame Diarmait MacMurrough for it? I mean, it probably would have happened anyway if Diarmait had never lived.
I don't think it was inevitable, to be honest with you.
Historian Dr. Grace O'Keefe.
I don't think that the resources that were required to be expended by the Crown in coming to Ireland I don't think they would have expended the effort that was needed. I think Diarmait gave them that in and kind of opened the chink a little bit, which then they capitalised on to get into Ireland. But look, even, if you look at the subsequent hundreds of years after 1169, Ireland wasn't really colonised until the plantation of Ulster in the 17th century, is what I would argue. Because up to that point, the English Crown did not have a uniform control over Ireland.
And as Grace O'Keefe just touched on, despite Ireland not being uniformly controlled by England until the 17th century, nevertheless, it was Diarmait MacMurrough who kick-started that centuries-long process of England taking control in Ireland. Sean Duffy.
Diarmait MacMurrough. I mean, he unleashed this English presence in Ireland, which it would have been nice if it was tidier, if it was a more balanced relationship. If the new English rulers of Ireland had decided that they wished to be sort of an impartial lord over all the inhabitants of Ireland, rather than being advocates for the colonists in Ireland, things might have been different. It is the case that when the English gained control of Ireland, they introduced English institutions into Ireland, including the English common law. But it's also the case that for most of the Middle Ages, the Irish were excluded from the common law, the English common law. So when you're denied justice in your own country, you're not really part of an equal dispensation, So I think you can't blame Diarmait MacMurrough for the fact that when Ireland became an English colony, that the rulers of England became advocates for only the colonists rather than the native population, and didn't try and ameliorate the conditions of the native population and become a kind of an impartial arbiter, rather than being, leaders of a kind of a colonial elite. I don't think you can blame Diarmait for that.
What's clear from prior commentary is that pinning 100% of the blame on Diarmait MacMurrough, the 12th century King of Leinster, for the English conquest and colonisation of Ireland over many centuries, from 1171 onwards, is perhaps a misinterpretation of history, incorrectly reading it backwards, and failing to factor in the complexities of Diarmait MacMurrough's times. Now, this is not letting Diarmait MacMurrough off the hook, but rather it's just acknowledging the fact that history is never black and white, but instead many subtle shades of motivation and circumstance.
The legacy of Diarmait MacMurrough has been one of blame for 800 years of occupation in Ireland.
His legacy is and always will be the lasting involvement of the English crown in Ireland.
His legacy is division, and it's a division that we've struggled with, but arguably that wasn't his plan.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.